Welcome to the Million Vegan Grandmothers podcast. And today I am so thrilled to have found Professor Barbara J. King. And I found Barbara as I was writing a book on grief mapping, and her book, How Animals Grieve. So enthralling, but also such a deep way of seeing our interconnection with animals. Thank you, Barbara, for being here.
Hi, Tammy. Thank you so much. I'm pleased to be here, and I thank you for all your work in connecting people and ideas.
Um, It's so important that we come together and share and talk and be able to emit what's going on in a heart-centered way. And that's what I really feel your writing's about. It's making the connection with animals and saying animals grieve, really, really authentically grieve.
Yes, I've spent my whole life with animals, living with animals, and now working on behalf of animals. And it has struck me repeatedly how incredibly important it is for us to see the other lives around us for who they are, what they are, how they feel, how they think. And I'm engaged with a large number of other people in the science community in trying to do storytelling to bring that to the fore and inviting people to think differently about animals.
Story is such an amazing way to bring people together and to share without it feeling threatening for a lot of people. So thank you for the story. And I think I know for myself and being a grandmother how my grandchildren really respond to story. And all of us are about story, not the old story of the way we may have been trained into disconnecting with animals, but the true stories of what actually happens with animals.
I
So,
agree. I agree.
mhm. So I would like to ask you a few questions, Barbara, that we had spoken of earlier. And one of them is, what are the quiet ways that animals show their grief? And how do these subtle signals reshape our understanding of their emotional lives?
Well, good. That's a good question to start because actually, I don't think the signals are all that often subtle. I think often animals show the searing nature of their grief to us very clearly and very firmly. I have documented examples where animals will wail at the body of a friend or refuse to leave a corpse or a burial spot for many hours or even days, or go through social withdrawal or failure to eat. This always reminds me of how the very well-meaning sentence, "We need to be voices for the voiceless," isn't really true about animals. Animals are not voiceless. And what I'm trying to do is listen to their embodied expressions of grief. So many of your listeners may remember the orca called Tahlequah, who showed us what grief looks like. This was in the summer of 2018, and her daughter died within an hour of being born. And Tahlequah swam for 17 days and 1,000 miles, keeping her daughter's small body on her own body. And to me, this was a very strong statement of connection with her daughter. It wasn't confusion or just stress, it was grief. And as this went on for 17 days, we didn't know where it was going to end or when it was going to end. I think it captivated people all around the world so that we can begin to use examples like that to see that animals are deeply connected with each other and feel their lives, and that we're surrounded by fellow creatures who feel very deeply.
So profound just to imagine this, to be connected in with that mother and calf.
It is. It is because there are some scientists, some zoologists who took up against the grief interpretation, who insisted that this was some kind of stress or confusion on the part of the mother. And I thought, my goodness, if we know about the deep cultural networks in the ocean with orcas and other marine creatures, we know to give them our understanding that this is awareness, it's connection, it's not confusion. And I felt a little sorry for people who are closed off in that way, because I think we enrich our lives when we see what other animals are doing.
Yeah, it's almost a way that we allow ourselves as, not so humankind to behave in a way that creates destruction and death and disease
Mhm,
for the
mhm,
oceans and for all the living beings. It's like
mhm.
if I can disconnect myself in some sort of pseudoscience way and say, this isn't really grief, it's confusion, it desensitizes a being.
Yes, and you're absolutely right to connect that to the actions that then follow that are harmful. I think in that same way.
Yeah. Thank you, Barbara. In what ways do the grieving rituals of animals reveal the depth of their connections and the impact of loss on their communities? I mean, you just spoke on that. Can you
Mhm.
elaborate?
Yes, I'm very interested in the presence of grief rituals, and I think that this field of animal grief and animals' responses to death more generally is very young. It's in its infancy, and we're only beginning to get a handle on this. I think what we know the most comes from elephants. Because as you may be aware, if an elephant matriarch, a female leader, dies, we know that elephants from different families come to the body. And some may just be curious. I'm not saying that everyone is grieving, but clearly, in some cases, matriarch friends or family members may carry out a vigil at the body, rock over the body, lift the feet over the body, and do all kinds of really species specific things that indicate grief. And we know too that if wild elephants are moving across a savanna and they come across bones that are old and bleached, there's no flesh left on them, they may caress these bones. And what's absolutely fascinating is that, at least in some cases, the animals who are spending real time and attention with the bones turn out to be relatives of the elephant who in life had those bones. And the reason we know that is because long-term elephant researchers like Cynthia Moss in Kenya map, who dies where the bones are. So they literally know the individual and where the individual died, and then watch what happens to the bones. So it's a very scientific framework, but it just kind of raises so many questions for me. How are the bones recognized after so long? I mean, there's many things we don't know, but it moves me very deeply because it does talk about kin and community to me. It brings up those questions of love and grief in kinship and in community.
Oh, it's it brings us into the realm of interconnection and the oneness that all of us someday will need to experience in order to heal, is that there's this ancient knowing within all of our bones.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, and our beingness.
And our belongingness, that's a word I like to use. Yeah.
Love that word, belongingness. And I speak of it a lot because it does. I was just sharing it with my partner when we were talking about a piece of our writing, is that the belongingness indicates that we're all here together, at this time, and if we're still breathing, we're meant to be here at this time. How does witnessing animal grief challenge us to see beyond our own experiences? And we were kind of talking about and recognize the shared aspects of our suffering across all species.
Yeah, to me, this is really the heart of it. I want to document others' observations of animal grief. It's important, but I also want to go beyond that and to think of how do we connect what we see with helping animals, with animal activism around the question of suffering. I made a point in a keynote talk I gave this summer at the Evolutionary Thanatology Symposium that was held in Kyoto. I was speaking online virtually. that it is time to, yes, keep documenting everything we can, but to move to these questions about our responsibility towards other animals. So this depth of feeling that I'm describing that animals experience, I mean, it tells us that animals' lives are complex and that they have good days and bad days, and that we'd better be sure, to the extent we can, to help them flourish. And of course, for me, this connects to two topics specifically, and there are many more, but animals who are considered to be food and why we need to move away from that type of food system. And secondly, why we need to really contest the use of animals in biomedical laboratories. I think that understanding animal grief and the love from which it emerges is really, again, an invitation for people to think, who are we putting on our plates? Who are we confining in our cages? And I want so much to find a way to talk openly about connecting those dots.
Mhm. Yeah, and where do we connect those? I was at a veg fest recently, and I picked up a book for my granddaughter, and my granddaughter and my grandson, 5 and 7 years of age, in July this year, were taken to celebrate Lucy's 49th birthday at the zoo with their parents and their auntie and uncle. And I had a very frank conversation with my granddaughter when she returned, and she was talking about what a great party it was and much fun Lucy had eating the popcorn they were feeding her. And I said, Lucy's in a prison and she's very unhappy. And and she says, Lucy's not in a prison. And I said, yeah, she is. And I explained to her that they live, like she would love to get a piece of land and have her whole family on there. She loves spending time with her grandmother, her Oma. We have a lot of fun together. And I said, imagine that's how Lucy would have lived. She never gets to see any of her family ever. And she understood that. So, how do we share with the young and let them lead the way to teach the elders that don't act in an elderly, wise way? That this is not any fun for an animal that has been captured at the age of 2 or 3 from her home and brought to a prison. How do we make people make those connections so that they're not relying on zoos as their way to think they have any information on these beings?
Yes, and first, of course, no elephant should be in a zoo. So we agree on that as a starting point to this conversation. And I come back to education, just as you say, and asking children to be in nature, to see animals as they live. And this is not an argument that's predicated on some kind of, purity of nature. I know that there's a lot of very harmed habitats out there, but rather the idea that taking a child to a national park, a state park, one's own backyard, and just inviting them to see who's there and how they live, and that this land is their land, that, we are building on their land, that we understand that we are meant to share our planet, not to just take and take. And I don't know. I think children are so open to that message, and that we need to give them alternative stories all the time, as you did.
Yeah, alternative stories and possibilities of the mainstream narrative for a lot of people. Yeah,
Mhm.
thank you. Can you share examples where animal mourning has moved beyond instincts? Almost conscious acknowledgement of loss. And you have so many stories of that in your book.
Well, I'm going to start by saying that maybe it's my anthropology training, but my position is that grief is not an instinct. My position is that it's a product of a very specific relationship and a specific emotional history between two beings that does not come from something that's evolutionarily ingrained, but rather comes from that context. So often I'll say, if you think about a couple of dogs living in a home, it's a good, happy home. They're all a family. And one dog dies of old age. Well, it's not necessarily the case that, let's say, the two remaining dogs will grieve. One may have been closer to the dead one and may mourn. The other may rise in the hierarchy in the home and may be actually joyful to have a new position. So I think the context and the specifics are important. And so I'll tell you a story based on those kinds of factors. And for me, it's a story that's close to my heart because it does speak about animals considered to be food, issues that are close to veganism and close to the hearts of anyone who thinks about food. So there were two ducks who were held in a foie gras factory in New York State. And immediately we understand this is a harmful thing, that they are treated cruelly. And they were rescued and they were brought to Farm Sanctuary in upstate New York, which is an absolutely wonderful place that I've been lucky enough to visit. These two ducks were called Harper and Cole, and they became so close and were, wandering over this sanctuary with freedom and had their friendship. And then at a certain point, one of them had just intractable pain from all this history that he had suffered. And the sanctuary folks very humanely euthanized him. And what they did is they invited his friend Harper to come and be with the body. This was very forward thinking. This was a while ago. And Harper draped his body over the body of Cole, over the body of his friend. He laid there. He just made connection, literal, physical, as well as emotional connection with the body. And then he grieved. It was very clear. This is a bird, a duck, who's grieving. He took himself off to a pond on the property where he had spent time with his friend. He went into social withdrawal. He didn't really respond to the staff's, very kind attempts to have him bond with someone else. He just grieved. And I thought about that so much because, here were two animals who were treated in the worst way for what, human luxury foods? I mean, just horrible, right? And yet they had heart, they had love, and then the survivor had grief. And how can you hear that and want to consign and flatten animals into food animals? It doesn't compute.
Yeah, once you know better, you must do better.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How does the expression of grief in animals make us reconsider the strength and depth of their emotional bonds? And you kind of just give an example of that and their ability to experience sorrow. So that was such a profound example. Did you want to
Yeah,
share?
you're exactly right to use the words strength and depth of emotional bonds. And I think what it tells us is that it is simply wrong to operate in a framework of human supremacy or human exceptionalism. As an anthropologist, I often make the distinction between human uniqueness and human exceptionalism, because clearly we are a unique species. We do things in human specific ways, but equally unique are ducks and trout and spiders and elephants and orcas. I mean, uniqueness is just part of evolutionary life. The problem comes in when we turn that into thinking that we're not just unique, but that we're special and we're better and then we're more than and we're, more emotional and more cognitive. And that's where things go wrong. So I think that these not only stories, but these profound observations of what other animals are doing can just stop us in our tracks and say, no, not exceptional.
Yeah, not exceptional. Part of the interconnection. I've interviewed Captain Paul Watson a few times, and
Mhm.
he really does bring home the message without, and I say this to my granddaughter a lot. No, I know you don't like wasps, these other fears that you have around bugs, but if we didn't have insects, we wouldn't be able to be here. And so she goes and asks her dad if this is true. I'm on that hierarchical spectrum. And I don't know
Well,
if he has the answers for her, but that's okay.
I'm so glad you brought up insects, really, because one thing I worry about a little is that my message gets misunderstood to say, okay, if an animal grieves, then that animal needs our care and our protection. Yes, of course, but that is not about boundary making. It does not mean that I want to leave out other animals. So, for example, wasps, spiders, frogs, I have no idea if there's a type of grief that they may experience. I don't close off the question, but let's say in the future we find out that here are animals who simply don't have, as part of their, smart, engaged lives, a grieving process. Well, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about them and work for their protection. So this is not about litmus tests and drawing a line. It's just one way to get into this question of animals' complex lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that interconnection of our belonging along with their belonging. And if they're
Mhm.
here, it's kind of like when people tell me, well, they got their tonsils cut out or they had their spleen cut out, and we can live without those things. So, maybe they're not that important, or their gallbladder. And I'm like, well, they were there because they were meant to be there. It's just whether we lived in harmony with these parts of our body. And it's kind of like whether we live in harmony with all living beings. They belong here as we do. So yeah, thank you. So how does the knowledge of animal grief influence our thoughts on veganism and our responsibility towards animals? And you answered this earlier on, we need to rethink using animals in laboratories and what's on our plate. Would you elaborate a little bit on this?
Yes, I'd like to. I'd like to start by saying that I have been both influenced and inspired by many vegan writers and activists. I understand veganism to be a comprehensive life commitment. So for my part, I don't ever eat cows and pigs, chickens, turkeys, lambs, goats, lobsters, shrimp, and octopuses, and have not for many years. And if I were to walk 2 rooms over, my refrigerator would be full of non-dairy milk and cheese and ice cream. But I do feel it's important for me to identify as plant-based. And I want to honor that difference between plant-based and vegan. And largely because of my medical history with a very nasty and aggressive cancer and lots of treatment for that cancer, I haven't been able to describe myself in good faith as vegan. I try to do better all the time. You were speaking about health and bodily systems, and wow, I have a lot of organs that are no longer with me, and I don't think it was because I was doing anything wrong, but I suffered from this cancer, so it's really affected my life. But to get back to the point, there's a wonderful film called Cow that was directed by Andrea Arnold, and it stars a cow named Luma, Luma. And the beautiful thing about this film is that it is shown as much as is humanly possible from her perspective. And she's living on a dairy farm, of course, and what we see, we know to expect, and that is that her sons and daughters are taken from her right at birth because we humans take the milk, commodify the milk for humans, and the sons and daughters don't get their mother's milk. What we see in the film is that Luma protests this. She bellows and she paces and she's aggressive and she's trying to keep her children with her, and that's not allowed to her. But what we see is grief. It's not necessarily that these children die right away. They are taken away and, put into the dairy industry, but it's still grief. It's grief of separation. And when I saw that film, I knew what was going to happen, right? Because when she's spent, she's killed. So I think of this and I think, is our responsibility not clear? Must we not keep fighting for animals like Luma, not only for her own life, but for her losses when she was living, because she's considered to be there for us. It's considered that her milk is for us. And so she suffers not only in terms of what happens to her, but in terms of what happens to her children. And I just think of that example frequently because I think we know at some level, people know it's different levels for different people that these intense harm of animal agriculture is just not sustainable and it's not right.
Yeah. Yeah, and you don't have to look very far to see this. Not very far
Mhm.
at all. Yeah. So, in what ways does understanding animal suffering call us to rethink our dietary choices and the impact on other living beings, like all living beings, whether it's their habitat being destroyed to graze cattle, whether it's killing a whole bunch of apex predators because they're near a farm, an animal agricultural farm, all of that?
Yes, all of it. My position has been that I really want to celebrate all serious attempts at reducing eating animals, eating dairy. And I know that this is met with, different reactions in vegan communities because, of course, vegan communities are not monolithic. Um, I do appreciate very much the reducitarian movement. And I'm talking here not about okay, I eat one plant-based meal on a Sunday and the rest of the week I'm going to eat meat. I'm talking about people who are seriously trying to very much change how they eat. And what I want to do is embrace all of those attempts and build on all of those attempts. And I have written extensively about farmed animals in a book called Personalities on the Plate and extensively about how really beautiful and joyful it is to recast our eating in a book called Animals' Best Friends. And so, again, it's about invitation, it's about storytelling, it's about recognizing the harms, but also the joys of eating differently and eating compassionately. I mean, not only just the delicious food that we know about, but just, the sort of moral sense of those joys so that we can link up the empathy that comes naturally to us as children and keep it going every day as we eat. And of course, I don't have to tell you this, but this is the type of work that I'm trying to do.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for mentioning the joy because there is, from what I've heard and from what I've really embodied, is the joyful ability to release stuff as it comes up being a vegan. I just know for certain I had a huge spiritual upgrade because just was able to not be so um, paralyzed by anxiety or suffering. It was just like I had more access to some level of freedom after going plant-based and then vegan. So and it's interesting what you're saying. It's just to love people where they're at, but that invitation. My son-in-law was here helping my daughter with something at my home when I was away, and he's a very heavy he was a very heavy meat-centric eater, and I had this ongoing debate with him through my grandchildren. Well, Dad said you need meat to be strong, and I'm like, well, that's not true. And this has been going on for 3 years. My son-in-law, he's been getting heart issues, and he's only 31, and he found a book on my shelf by Dr. Greger, How Not to Die. And he said he just couldn't put it down. And he said, Tammy, I'm not going to say that I can't, that I'm not going to eat meat again, but I really want to try 90% plant-based. And he has done that. And 4 weeks later, his acid reflux has left and he's feeling lighter and he's lost some weight. He was getting quite heavy and his blood pressure is normalized in 4 weeks. And so, I call it the study of one. He's feeling the difference in such a short period of time. And of course, when our physical health starts to become more in alignment with how we want to feel, how we can feel, we feel more joyful. I mean, how could we not?
Mhm. Very much so. And I like the idea of just gently overturning assumptions. In my work, I'm often told very firmly, well, we evolved to be meat eaters. And, there's a sort of grain of truth in the extent that we did human ancestors did eat meat. And that's not something that anyone should feel compelled to deny, that meat eating part of our evolution. but it's never been obligate. It's never been, something that we have to do. And in fact, at one point, 2 million years ago, meat eating did fuel growth of the human brain. And I would like to say that now we have that human brain and we need to think about eating compassionately, that there's no requirement to eat meat. And at the same time, I realize that millions of people around the world are currently dependent on meat and fish protein, and that has to change. If we want people to be able to live compassionately, they need access, of course, to nourishment for their families. And that's a whole different conversation, but it's an important conversation.
Yes, and it's an ongoing conversation. And as close as, and I think that's where the elders, the billion vegan grandmothers, and I'm not talking for all of the grandmothers out there. I'm saying for myself, I do not have any vegans in my family, in my biological family, and I'm not going to stop loving them. I'm not going to be continually judging them. I can be that living example, and that's what's happening. I'm showing up, and I have energy, and I'm compassionate, and I'm available, and I'm healthy. And so it's showing up as a person aligning with our respect, and I with our respect for all living beings. And I'm not saying that eating plant-based is going to guarantee health. I'm not going to make um, that very righteous statement. I would never do that. I had health issues that were very much tied in with a lot of other things, like childhood emotional processing that I had to deal with, and that's a huge
Mhm.
thing for a lot of people. So I just want to recognize that the grief of our childhood, even as humans, does indicate how we're going to show up in the world later on, and we are continually realigning that who we are now, upgrading who we are now. Yeah.
Mhm. Right. And then the question, thinking anthropologically, as I tend to do, is how do we scale up? How do we scale up, for many, many other communities?
Yeah. That's it's brilliant. Scale up. Um, just going to ask one more question on veganism and animals, and then we'll go to the broader implications of these choices of really making that connection between how animals grieve. But how might this awareness of animal sorrow inspire us to embrace lifestyles that minimize harm and promote empathy towards all animals? And we've been speaking about this all along, but I wonder if you'd just like to wrap up, the veganism piece and
Mhm.
moving to the broader implications.
Yeah, I think sometimes what happens is because I have a especially deep fondness for octopuses and I write about them so much. And as you may know, there's a terribly harmful plan to scale up again that term, industrial farming of octopuses, particularly now in Spain, but other places too. And I have been involved in activist reaching out against this and talking about why this is not good. And so sometimes people will come up to me and say, well, thank you for your work. I don't want to eat octopuses anymore, or I don't eat octopuses anymore. And I love that. But then I want to say, how about the chicken? I want, again, it's this process of saying, let's have this window open with whatever may catch, your empathy. That's great. That's a starting point. And then we just want to understand that the life that we're surrounded with, they just, again, I come back to that phrase of having good days and bad days. And so why are we not very, very much involved in making sure that we can offer them good days, making our lives better and more joyful? Just as you have said, there's payment for us, even if that may not be our primary motivation. And of course, what I'm saying has been a bedrock of vegan movements for a long time. So, I've been influenced by people ranging from Carol Adams to Lori Gruen to Tracy McWhorter to Angela Davis, all of this stuff. We just read and think and continue enlarging our understanding and our communication with all different communities.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. As Ram Dass says, we're all just walking each other home. And it's as soon as we open up that little window, that little crack, and somebody is in someone's vicinity that cares about them, we can find our way into places where people may never ever look. They may never look, and we can be that living testament of embodied knowledge, as you say. And so when we're looking at the broader implications, how can knowledge about animal grief inspire broader changes, like how we relate and care for animals daily? So a day in the life of, all the little choices we make.
Yeah, and of course, I have to start again with the meal choices because that is just every day. Our food is threaded through everything we do, how we share food with others, how we make a community through food. And so that's the first step. I think so often about holidays, Thanksgiving in this country, holidays elsewhere, as a chance to maybe invite conversations and share dishes with others that bring a new perspective, a new lightness, and a new joy. Of course, I'm talking about no animals, talking about, of totally plant-based. But there's other things too, because I think how we entertain ourselves comes into this conversation, and not going to a theme park in which orcas or killer whales are kept and made to, in one way or another, entertain us. And you mentioned earlier in this conversation, zoos, and especially perhaps roadside zoos that very explicitly exploit animals. I know that we can extend that to all zoos, but I do want to make some sort of distinction of hierarchy of harms in the zoo world. We can think of our own companion animals. I mean, this can range from cats and dogs to rabbits and horses and snakes. And, there's a tremendous amount of dualism in how, in this country and others, we treat animals that are considered pets, not a term that I really like. The idea that, they're here to make our lives better is in one sense wonderful if it's based on fully mutual respect and full mutual attunement. But it has to be. We have to really see that we have these deep responsibilities, not only just for the basic vet care and good food, but these animals who live in our homes can be bored. How do we give them a life in which they flourish? How do we really respond to their emotional needs? I mean, the numbers of issues are great. And the last book that I wrote specifically tried to take up these different contexts of the ways that we interact with other animals. And in chapter by chapter, it invites people to say, what can I concretely do for animals in the wild, animals in our homes, animals in zoos, animals in laboratories, and animals who are in some places on our plates? Not on your plate, not on my plate, and I think it's a wonderful exercise to really ask ourselves, how can we show up? How can we be present? And in my case, it is absolutely imperfectly. And I try to weave stories into my writing that show that imperfection, that I don't do enough, that I make mistakes, that I'm not there. But you use this great word of upgrade, and that it is a constant aspiration and it's a constant striving, and that we shouldn't be afraid to talk to each other about that, as you said yourself, it's not about looking at each other and expecting perfection or being better than someone else. And I think that's a really huge part of this conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And where we start out, and as you were sharing, Barbara, throughout this unity connection that I feel with you is, I grew up eating flesh food. I mean, it was how my father, at that point, that was what he knew to keep his family fed. We didn't have a lot of money, and we lived on moose meat and some other food that we had. And but my father was very connected to nature, and I remember him saying when he went out moose hunting with my brother, who was financially, secure enough. He didn't need to go kill animals. He didn't need to eat them, whatsoever. But him saying how he cried that last moose he killed. He said, I don't need to kill a moose anymore to feed my family.
Mm.
And it's that upgrade, and it's the non-judgment of, letting people come to, as Dr. Silas Rao said in Climate Healers, and the Million Vegan Grandmothers are a part of Climate Healers, is he's starting a campaign now about one more thing. Let's just do one more thing. And it makes it doable. What's the one thing I can do today that isn't going to overwhelm me? I already have a full plate. Maybe I can reach out to this person that wrote the book about Lucy as our friend and say thank you. Or maybe I can start a campaign that a friend of mine who passed away from cancer started in our community, Jiva, Thanks Living. And maybe I could start a Thanks Living before Thanksgiving in my
Mhm.
area about how we don't have to use animals to celebrate. And maybe we should shift from that. So it's that maybe that one more thing is our upgrade. The one thing we can do today that will allow us to feel that we're doing that one thing. Maybe it's that letter, maybe it's that connection, maybe it's an email of thank you to someone who's already on the front lines. So thank you for that.
Oh, I love that, Tammy. That's a really good set of insights. I'm glad that you mentioned subsistence hunting because I do really acknowledge that there are people all around the world who don't have choices, and that again, I do feel it is the responsibility of those of us who do have choices and resources to work towards enabling, a different situation.
Mhm.
And I also think that, again, it comes back to often the one thing we can do today may involve children. Would not necessarily our own children. We may not have children. I do, but not everyone does. But I think it was about 7 days ago now, I gave a birthday present to a beautiful 3-year-old girl in my family. The book is called Inky the Octopus, and it's about the very famous now octopus who escaped an aquarium through a set of step-by-step, very cognitive choices and let himself out of the aquarium and went off to freedom. And I thought that the book was beautiful because it wasn't a heavy preaching message. It was just beautiful drawings of an octopus wishing to be out in the world where he belonged. And I thought, that's something I can give this child. It will be fun for her and maybe plant a seed.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Children's books are such a great piece of our work. And also one of our grandmothers, Charity Khan, just wrote a book called or did an album called The Vegan Album. So we're able to find that on Spotify and other areas. And it's not a preachy album. It's not, and not that there's anything wrong with preaching. Preaching can be very therapeutic and very life-centered. So I'm not going to make preaching a negative verb, action word. I'm going to say sometimes I get a little preachy and it's just my passion and my involvement. But it's when preachy comes in the form of really acute judgment and polarization, because that it's not helpful, because most of us have a sense of not belonging. Many of us come into this world fighting with this sense of not feeling we fully belong and not feeling we're quite good enough. As the Buddha said, most of us feel most suffering is created from not feeling we're enough and feeling that we're separate. And that's very true when we look at animal compassion and working towards a better way of living that includes the animals and not having just human-centered grief. I'm writing a book right now with my partner called Grief Mapping, and it's looking at accumulated grief right across the board and how we
Mhm.
can understand that the grief that we suffer is interconnected to the grief that we're creating in the world. And so um, I think that's a really important understanding. Barbara, I would
Oh, Oh, go ahead.
But I would love you to share on what I just said. And then I would like you to, I have a few more questions for you. I know that we're going to do another podcast really soon. And I'm wondering if you would just share on what I just said, and then maybe just um, finished one more question that I had sent you, just
Mhm.
right on one more thing I sent, and then we will finish up our podcast for today. It's been a real joy and a pleasure and a gift. You're an absolute gift. Thank you, Barbara.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for saying that. And I think we're fine just to go ahead. I don't need to go back. So would you like me to talk a little bit about one more way in which I see dot connecting happening between grief and the way we treat animals in society? Is there
That
time
would
for
be
that?
beautiful. Yes. Yeah, I
Okay.
really appreciate that. That's a really good way to wrap up this podcast.
Okay. I had briefly mentioned the topic of animal research, and this is something that I'm very passionate about, something that you just talked about, your passion. And there's a very deep culture in science in this country that I believe is based on falseness, that we need animals in our laboratories to be invasively tested on in order to protect human health. And in fact, the statistics don't back that up at all. So we have, on the one hand, this moral case that it's wrong to cage and harm animals. That is just across the board. And then behind that, we have the new and burgeoning knowledge that even this attempt to use animals to help human health isn't working. I don't think it would be okay if it were, but it simply isn't. So we need to understand that the animals, whether they are cats, dogs, monkeys, ferrets, rabbits, fishes, octopuses, they all have emotional lives, and they are being reduced to laboratory tools in this very, very harmful way. And so, these animals naturally are part of whole networks of families and social friends. And in the laboratory, they may make some kind of bonds in this impoverished environment. And there may be a lot of grief in the laboratory. But whether there's grief or not, these animals are torn from their networks. It's wrong. These animals are not actually protected, and as many people would like to think, by ethics committees, that they don't have protection. So it's up to us. And we know that many of us wish there were glass walls in slaughterhouses. And I feel the same way for biomedical laboratories, that we can resist this true propaganda from the biomedical community and understand that part of our responsibility is not only, 3 meals a day and all these other things, but to stand up for these animals and to really work for investment in non-animal methods. And that deeply, deeply matters to me.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. Because as my daughter tells me, we're not we're not rats. We respond differently. So we cannot be using animals as a way to test for humans. And we already have the basis of so much of our science, what we know is real and good and true. And in the cosmetic companies alone, what they're using animal testing for, we don't need to put these chemicals and these toxic material cosmetic stuff on our bodies. We can just do it naturally the way it always was before now, the way it
Mhm.
always was before now. So it's coming back to who we authentically are, coming back to the earth.
Yeah. Mhm.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Any final words?
Well, I think I would just want to say at the end that it is a challenge to think beyond our own ways of being in the world. I think it's a challenge we can meet. I want to have hope and I want to have optimism. But when it comes back to grief, the challenge is not to expect animals to always grieve the exact way we do, and to put into practice what we always want to do, to see animals for themselves, to hear their voices, to hear their embodied voices, and to get at the fact that there are many, many ways of being profoundly emotional and profoundly thoughtful in this world. And it adds richness to our life to see that, as well as helping other beings. And that's where I'd like to go, is where I'd like to us to go as a community of caring people.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because what you're saying and what I hear you saying is that we don't have to see it as we're giving anything up. Oh, I really like my steak. We're actually enriching each other's lives by stopping the grief and suffering of other beings. We're enriching our lives. We're moving towards a more joy embodied way of being, and we're healing each other. We're working towards human, earth, and animal liberation. And so, how could that not be an embodied upgrade?
Right, exactly. I've started to speak about animal grief in explicit pairing with ecological grief for the earth. And I know that's part of what you're writing about. I see them as inextricably linked, and that understanding one will help understanding the other, and that will help understanding human grief, because everything is linked in that way. So thank you so much for a really good conversation. I appreciate it so much.
I appreciate you. Thank you so much, Barbara.